Oh, good day to you, friends. Seamus here. Thank you for joining me today for an absolutely magical Yuletide story. This is a fine old Scottish legend from many hundreds of years ago. It is called simply the Yule Beggar. So let's just go ahead and get started. As our story begins, it is the first morning of Yule, and a grandfather living in a shepherd's hut at the bottom of a small valley had spent the long night alone, sitting by the fire, remembering his ancestors, thinking about the year come past. He had no one living with him but his young grandson, just about 8 or 9 years old. All of his children and other grandchildren had moved away to neighboring towns and villages for the sake of better work, and there he was alone with just the young boy to take care of the family flock and see them through the winter. Well, he rose up that morning, the first morning of Yule. The solstice was gone, and he did all the chores. He woke the boy, and of course, they got the sheep out and ready. They got the water down and the feed laid out, turned the sheep loose on the hills to go out and enjoy their day, and went about the regular chores that they had to do. But clearly, something was troubling the old man, and several days passed, and the young boy kept looking and wondering what was bothering his Shenar, his grandfather. And finally, he said to him, Shenar, what is it? What is it? Something's bothering you, sir, and I don't know what it is, and I'd like to help if I could. And the grandfather explained that he really, really wanted to travel over the hills. He wanted to go to the neighboring village to visit most of his children and grandchildren. The boy's parents were further away, but he could see most of his kith and kin if only he could get away from the flock. And of course, he couldn't leave because there was no one else to care for the sheep. Well, the boy looked at him and he said, Grandfather, you've been teaching me now for over a year how to take care of the flock. I know what to do. I know how to lay out their food. I know how to check their hooves and look in their eyes. And I know how to take good care of them. And I know all the rules. I know how to feed them. And you should go. You can go. Leave me. I'll take care of the flock. Well, the grandfather, as you can appreciate, was hesitant. He was an older man, and this flock was all that he had for his wealth. But he also knew that he had to trust the boy. So they made an agreement that day, just as the sun was getting to its highest point. The old man folded up a little bit of food and an extra shirt and his warm slippers into a blanket and threw it up over the shoulder, and he went through the rules again with the young boy. All the sheep have to be down off the hills before the sun is fully set. Make sure you've got them all tucked away into the sheepfold so the weather or the wolves won't get to them. They're going to be thirsty, and if the trough freezes over, you have to break the ice up. You might have to heat some water by the fire. There's a crock of soup in the corner for you to eat tonight in the morning. There's lots of wood for the fire. Take good care. Feed the sheep. You know all the rules. And if I'm going to trust you, lad, I have to trust you. And he gave his young grandson a big hug, and he set off over the hills. And now the boy is entirely alone down near the bottom stream of this shallow valley with a flock of about 24 sheep to take care of and no one to speak with. Well, he enjoys his freedom for a little while. He's running up and down the hills and he's yahooing wherever he goes. But soon he realizes that the sun has passed its highest point, and it's a very short day that time of year in the hills of Scotland. And he started to drive the sheep down. And up and down the hills he went, and over the streams and behind the bushes. He went around the big patch of willow trees down into the gorse was down in the ditch, and he checked along there, and he drove all the sheep down. He got them all back just as the sun was starting to touch the top of the western hills, and he made sure there was fresh water out for them. He made sure that they had feed to nibble on during the night, and then he did the most important part of his job, in that he counted the flock. And he counted them, and he counted, and he counted again. And after 3 times counting, he realized that he was missing one sheep. And as far as he could tell, it was the old ewe, the great mama of the family, if you will. And he knew that he had to find her. Well, off he went again. He made sure to set the gate and cover in the fold. The sheep were well cared for, and off he went again, up and down every little stream, every little rivulet, onto the hills, under the gorse, looking under the brambles and the bracken, pushing the dried heather back, all around the willow trees and down into the stream. And no matter what he did, he could not find this one lost sheep. And he was terribly troubled because he had given his word to his father, and night was approaching. The sun now was almost fully behind the hills, and he went and he did it all again, and then he did it again after that, checking everywhere, willow trees, under the gorse, along the streams, everywhere he could think of. And he could not find this one lost sheep. Well, the time came that it was simply too dark to look. He knew that going out he wouldn't see anything even if she was out there, and he decided to keep himself in the bothy and wait for a few hours until the sun was fully gone, and perhaps the cloud would part and the rising moon would give him enough light to search for the sheep. And he did that very thing. He noticed the pot of soup over in the corner, and he thought maybe he could warm the soup up and then go out and have a bite to eat before he went out to search for the sheep. But he felt so bad taking care of himself before the sheep, and he waited and he waited. And finally the clouds started to part a little bit. The night was full. The moon was rising over the eastern hills, and he knew that he could go out. And just as he was getting ready to leave, he remembered something, an old story that his grandfather told him when he was much younger. And that was at the far, far bottom of their valley, where the streams flowed down and gathered into the river that fed out into the bay, there was a very important well. And it was named after Saint Ninian, an early saint from those parts. And there was two things he remembered his grandfather saying. One was that Saint Ninian was known to visit the valleys on Christmas Eve. The other was that Saint Ninian was known to be very helpful for people who had lost things. And the boy thought for a moment, it's Christmas Eve tonight, and I've lost something. I've lost one of my sheep. And maybe, since this is a valley so familiar to Ninian, maybe I could go to his well and I could ask his help. And just as he thought that, he had he was going to go ahead. He would warm up the soup and he would have a bite to eat, and he would go and make his appeal to Saint Ninian. But then he thought for a moment. He said, wait a minute, I'm just a boy. Who am I to ask for help from a man like Ninian? And I have nothing to offer him. Surely all those people would have left some gift behind, and I have nothing. Who wants my ragged old broken boots and the blanket that I sleep on? I have nothing except that soup. And at that moment he realized the most precious thing he had was that clay jar full of soup. And he decided right then, what else could he do? He would warm the soup up, he would take it to the well, he would offer that soup up to Saint Ninian as an offering and beg the help of the saint that somehow he would find his lost sheep. And he did that very thing. It was now fully dark. The light of the moon was there, but it wasn't all that much. And he took the soup, he pulled the jar up against the fire that he had built up until the soup was nice and steamy. He wrapped that crock up in an old bundled up bit of blanket rag, and off he went down the valley to St. Ninian's well. Now around the well there was a stone wall, probably 2.5, 3 feet high. And he set that jar down on top of the wall, and he threw the blanket over his shoulder. And once the jar of soup had been set there with the steam rising into the evening dark, he turned himself away from the well and he fell down into the snow, and he looked up into the dark evening sky and he called out, "Can you hear me? Is there anyone there? I'm asking Saint Ninian to come and help me. I've lost a sheep, and Ninian loves to help lost things, and it's Christmas Eve, so maybe Ninian, you're on the way. I don't know, but if you can hear me, will you help me?" He stood up ever so quietly. He listened to the wind and he heard nothing. He looked downstream, he saw no movement, nothing. He looked up, he saw nothing, no sheep, no movement of any kind. He could hear the wind blowing through the trees. He looked up the hills, there was nothing anywhere around him. And just as he went to step away and head back to the bothy and his warm fire, he heard a noise behind him, a noise that sounded distinctly like a metal spoon clinking against a clay pot. And spinning around, suddenly out of nowhere, there was a man sitting on the side of the well. Sitting on that stone well was an old man, his beard long down to his knees, wrapped up in various bits of ragged cloth, blanketing and old shirting, and his feet bound up in nothing but rags. But he was sitting there holding the crock of soup, taking bite after bite. And he nodded to the young boy and he said, "It's a grand night, lad. Thank you for the soup." Now, the boy was really upset. He had brought that soup. It's all he had to eat until his grandfather got back, and he brought it to offer to the saint. And here was this old man eating it, but he thought, well, if Ninian's not going to be here, I might as well feed this old beggar. The boy said, "It might be a grand night for you, sir, but it's not for me. I've lost one of my sheep." And the old man licks his spoon. He says, "Aye, the sheep you're looking for is down in the bottom of the stream, trapped in the gorse behind the willow forest." The boy said, "Sir, I'm sorry, but I've checked around that willow forest 3 times. There's no sheep there." And the old beggar says, "Well, be that as it may, if you know the valley better than I do, but I'm pretty sure that's where you'll find your sheep." And he licked the spoon clean and was scraping the pot for another bite. And he finished up and he looked at the boy and he says, "You seem so sad, lad. Would it hurt you to look one more time? Maybe let's go for a walk. I'll give you a bit of a hand." And off they walked. And they walked up along the stream bed towards that small willow forest, and they made their way around to one of the little rivulets that fed into the stream. And sure enough, down in the deep ditch of that river, there was a massive pile of gorse and bracken and bramble, dried up stems of heather, every bit of nasty, thorny thing you could think of. And sure enough, as they leaned in and listened ever so close, they heard one tiny little bah, and the boy knew the sheep was down there. He slid down that hill quick as you could, his old leather boots breaking through the ice, water up to his knees, rushing into his boots, mud up to his waist, and he's tearing through that bracken and pulling back the brambles and ripping away at the stalks and the thorns. He's all scratched up. He doesn't care. He wants to save his sheep, and he pulls and he pulls and he tears, and no matter what he does, he just can't get through to the sheep to get her out. And he can see that she's trembling and she's panting and she's scared, and along comes the old man sliding down behind him, and the two two of them go to work. And that old beggar, suddenly, it was like he had the strength of 10 men. He's snapping away long branches of those bramble patches and tearing out the thorns. He's plucking things out of that old sheep's fleece, and he's parting her away, and he clears a path where they can drag her up out of the gorse, up onto the side of that little rivulet. And the boy looks down at the sheep, and she can't stand. She's exhausted, she's panting, she's scared, she's hungry. And the boy said, well, it's good that we found her, but what am I to do now? I'm a little boy. I can't pick up a sheep. And the old man said, I said you weren't alone, lad. I can help you with this. And you would think this scrawny, rail-thin beggar would barely be able to carry himself. But he reached down and he grabbed that sheep by the feet and picked her up and threw her over his neck and wore her like a scarf as they headed on down the hill towards the bothy. Well, the boy scampered in and he started to get the fire built up, and the old beggar man, he laid that sheep down on the floor, and they chatted with her real nice, and they petted her nose, and the boy warmed up some water and fed her little trickles of water off of his fingertips, and he got a little bit of the feed into her, and it wasn't very long at all before she started to sigh quietly and make some happy sheep noises, and sooner or later she curled up and she went to sleep. Well, the boy looked at the old man. He says, I'm so grateful to your help, sir. I'm happy that you helped me find my sheep. In a little bit, I'll get her moved in with her friends. But this night would have been lost without your help. And the old man said, it's no trouble at all, son. I'm happy to help, and thank you very kindly for the soup. And the boy said to him, sir, he says, I've got nothing else to offer you. The soup is gone. It's all I had. My grandfather won't be back till the high sun of tomorrow, but you could at least stay with me in the bothy tonight. We've got the small fire. We'll be warm and safe and dry. Would you like to stay? And the old man looked at the boy and he said, no, lad, I can't stay. It's Christmas Eve. I've got to go. He said, well, where is it would you be going on Christmas Eve, sir? And he says, it's Christmas Eve. I've got to make my way to Bethlehem to say hello to my young friend, the babe in the manger. Well, the boy thinks this old fella has just cracked right up, and he smiles and he says, very well, sir, very well, whatever you wish. And he turned away to tend to the fire, and just as he tended to the fire, he heard a click behind him, and he knew it was the sound of the latch of the bothy closing, and he jumped up and turned, and sure enough, the old man was gone. And he rushed to the door, and he pushed the door open, and there was nobody there. It had only been 2 or 3 seconds. He looked upstream, downstream, he looked across the field. He couldn't see the old man, but he looked down at his feet, and he saw prints in the snow of those rag-wrapped feet making their way away. He didn't give much thought to the fact that the man was heading towards the south and the east. But the boy followed the footprints in the snow, and he followed them for a few minutes up as they went up and up towards one of the hills. And all of a sudden, coming towards the top of a ridge, the feet prints, they just suddenly stopped, like the old man had just vanished. And the boy looked at the prints, he looked at his own feet, he looked behind him, he looked over the hill. He couldn't see the old man anywhere. It was clear that just as he appeared somewhat magically at the well, now again he's gone. There's nobody there. And as he looked up from his feet and turned his face towards the sky, looking towards the south and the east, where maybe you might look for Bethlehem, in the distance there was a very, very bright star. And in that moment, the young boy knew that his words had not gone unanswered. For surely who else showed up out of nowhere on the site of St. Ninian's Well on Christmas Eve in answer to the call from a young boy that had lost something but St. Ninian himself. And just as he had shown up in a moment, he had disappeared in a moment. The boy couldn't help but laugh and smile, and he made his way back to the hut, closed the door behind him. He had escorted the wee sheep back into their pen with the rest of the sheep, and he built the fire up a little bit, and he reached for one of his blankets to wrap around his shoulders to get himself comfortable. And as he reached for the blanket, he discovered something there, a gift that Ninian had left behind. For there, on top of that folded pile of blankets, was a small loaf of bread, still warm from the oven, in a place where there was no oven. And he took the bread and he smiled and he was grateful for it. He broke it open. He gave a good smell. He held it up in thanksgiving. He set half of it down and he plucked away at that bread and got his belly nice and full and set the rest of the bread down and rolled himself up into his blankets and settled in for a fine, long sleep. Well, the next morning he rose up, he did his chores, and sure enough, as the sun was approaching its highest point in the sky today, he wasn't surprised to look to the east and see his grandfather coming over the hills and down the long, warm path to the bothy. And immediately the old man greeted his grandson, and he checked on the flock and made sure everything was well. He could see the sheep gambolling across the hills, and he knew that everything was good. And he went in and he said to the boy, he said, warm the fire up. I bought a big crock of soup for our lunch. And he reached into his bag and he brought the soup out and he pushed the jar towards the fire. And as they sat down, the old man said, you know, lad, the only thing that would be better than this right now is if we had a bit of bread to dip in this soup. The boy smiled and reached over to his blanket pile, and he came back with the other half of that loaf, broke a chunk off, handed it to his grandfather. The grandfather looked at the boy and said, wherever did you get bread in the middle of nowhere on Christmas Eve? And he said, grandfather, I have a few things to tell you. Thank you for trusting me with the sheep. It was an absolutely magical night. Friends, I do thank you for joining me today. This is a bit of an unusual story, I know, and a bit longer than you're used to, and I thank you for sticking along with me. I appreciate so much all of you that have liked and shared the videos these last few weeks here. We have a whole bunch of new subscribers. I'm grateful for all of you. Thank you. Thanks for sharing it out. Thanks for subscribing. We will see you again with another silly joke in the middle of next week after Christmas time. But in the meantime, take good care of yourselves and take good care of each other, and we will see you soon. Cheers. Ho, 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 ho.